The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floor. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the air carried that particular chill that reminds you summer is truly gone. Judge Judy walked down the corridor with her usual purposeful stride, her mind already preparing for what would be another day of listening to people argue about money, contracts, and the endless ways humans find to disappoint each other. But something about this particular case had caught her attention, even before she stepped into the courtroom. The file on her desk was thinner than most. There were no lengthy depositions, no mountains of financial documents, no angry letters written by expensive lawyers. Instead, there was just a simple handwritten note from the court administrator. "Judge, you need to see this one. It's not about money." Those 7 words told her that today would be different. She'd been sitting on the bench for over 4 decades. In all that time, she had learned to read people the way other people read books. She could spot a liar from across the room, could tell when someone was hiding something behind their carefully chosen words. But she had also learned something else. There were moments, rare and precious moments, when the law intersected with something far deeper than contracts and damages. Moments when the real work of justice had nothing to do with courtrooms at all. This was going to be one of those moments. She could feel it in her bones. The bailiff announced the case just after 10 o'clock. Martinez versus Henderson, property dispute and breach of verbal agreement. Judge Judy looked up from her notes and watched as the courtroom doors opened. The first person to enter was a man in his mid-40s, wearing a faded navy blue jacket that had seen better days. His name was Robert Henderson, though everyone who knew him called him Bobby. He walked with the kind of slowness that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time. Not the weight of objects, but the weight of regret. Behind him, held in the hand of a woman who looked to be in her early 40s, was a boy. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, maybe 9 at the most. He wore brown pants that were slightly too large, held up with an old leather belt, and a white shirt that had been ironed with obvious care. His shoes were clean but worn, and his hair had been combed neatly to one side. But what caught Judge Judy's attention most was his face. It held an expression of remarkable calm for a child in a courtroom, mixed with something that looked like determination mixed with fear. The woman holding his hand was Miguel Martinez. She was the boy's mother, and she had brought him here today for a reason that the file had only hinted at. The plaintiff's side was represented by a lawyer named David Chen, a sharp-looking man in his 50s who wore expensive glasses and the kind of confidence that comes from always winning. He stood as Maria and the boy entered, acknowledging them with a professional nod but nothing more. This was business to him. This was a case. To Miguel Martinez, this was everything. Judge Judy noticed these details, the way a skilled musician notices every note in a complicated symphony. She had learned over decades that the real story of any legal case was never really about the legal parts. It was about the people. It was about what they had lost, what they had hoped for, and what they were willing to fight for. "Let's begin," Judge Judy said, settling back in her chair. "Mrs. Martinez, tell me what brings you to my courtroom today." Miguel Martinez stepped forward, her hand never leaving her son's shoulder. When she spoke, her voice carried an accent that suggested English was her second language, but her meaning came through clearly. "Your Honor, this man promised my son something 3 years ago. He promised to pay for his education, for his future. He said my boy would go to a good school, and he would help pay for everything. He gave us his word." Judge Judy raised her eyebrows slightly. "And you're seeking damages for breach of this verbal agreement?" "I'm seeking," Maria said carefully, "for him to keep his promise to my son. The money matters, yes, but this is about more than money. This is about a child who was told he was going to have a future, and then that future was taken away." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers moving across her keyboard, recording every word. Judge Judy turned her attention to Robert Henderson. "Mr. Henderson," she said, "your response?" Robert Henderson stood slowly. He was a carpenter by trade, someone who spent his days working with his hands, building things, fixing things. His face was weathered by sun and time, and his hands showed the calluses and small scars that came with years of physical labor. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "Your Honor, I did promise to help with the boy's education. That's true, but my circumstances changed. I lost my job about 2.5 years ago. I've been working odd jobs since then, just trying to survive. I couldn't afford to make good on that promise. I'm sorry about that, but I couldn't help it." Judge Judy studied him for a long moment. She had learned over the years that people were rarely just good or just bad. They were usually complicated, filled with contradictions, doing the best they could with what they had, which sometimes wasn't much. But she had also learned that promises to children held a special weight. They weren't like other promises. They mattered in ways that went beyond money. "Let me hear the full story," she said. "How did this promise come about?" Maria Martinez began to explain. 3 years ago, she had been working as a housekeeper for a family where Robert Henderson was doing renovation work. Her son, whose name was Miguel, had been 5 years old at the time. He was shy, quiet, and sometimes struggled with reading. Maria had worried constantly about his future, about whether he would have the opportunities she had never had. Robert Henderson had taken an interest in the boy. He would sit with Miguel during lunch breaks and read to him. He would help the young child sound out words, encourage him when he got frustrated, celebrate his small victories. For a lonely child with a single mother who worked long hours, Robert had become something like a friend, maybe something like a father figure. And one day, Robert had made a promise. He had said that Miguel was smart, that he had potential, and that if Miguel worked hard in school, Robert would make sure he got into a good private school. Robert had promised that he would help pay for it. He had said that Miguel deserved a chance, that every child deserved a chance. Miguel had believed him completely. For 2 years, Miguel had worked hard in school. He had improved his reading. His grades had gotten better. He had made friends, and he had waited for the day when Robert Henderson would help him get into that good school. But then Robert had lost his job, and then the calls had become less frequent, and then Robert had moved to a different city for work, and the promises had simply faded away like morning mist. Now Miguel was 8 years old, and he was in public school in a struggling neighborhood. He was still a good student, but he didn't talk about his dreams the way he used to. Something inside him had changed when Robert Henderson's promise had disappeared. "Where is the boy?" Judge Judy asked suddenly. "Let me speak with him." A hush fell over the courtroom. This was unusual. Judge Judy rarely asked to speak directly with children. It was considered poor courtroom practice, too emotionally complicated, too unpredictable. Miguel stepped forward slowly. He looked even smaller in the vast courtroom, surrounded by the formality and weight of the legal system. He climbed into the witness chair with help from the bailiff, his feet not quite reaching the ground below. Judge Judy looked at him with the same intensity she brought to every person who entered her courtroom. But there was something else there too. There was gentleness. "Miguel," she said, and her voice was different now, warmer. "Do you know why you're here today?" The boy nodded. "My mother says Mr. Bobby didn't keep his promise." "And how does that make you feel?" Judge Judy asked. Miguel was quiet for a long moment. He looked down at his hands, which were folded in his lap. "It makes me sad," he said finally, "because I believed him. I worked really hard in school because I believed what he said. And then he stopped talking to us." "Do you understand what money is?" Judge Judy asked. "Yes," Miguel said. "It's what people use to buy things. My mother works to get money so we can have a house and food and stuff. If I gave your mother money to replace what Mr. Henderson didn't pay for your school, would that make you feel better?" Miguel thought about this very seriously, the way only a child can think about complicated emotional questions. "I don't know," he said finally. "The money doesn't give me back what I thought was going to happen. The money doesn't give me back believing in what Mr. Bobby said." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Judge Judy felt something shift inside her, the way it shifts when you encounter real truth expressed simply and without any pretense. She turned back to Robert Henderson. "Did you hear what he said?" Robert Henderson was looking at his hands. His shoulders were shaking slightly. "I heard him," he said quietly. "Do you understand the damage your broken promise caused?" Judge Judy asked. "I do now," Robert said, and something in his voice suggested that he really, truly did. But Judge Judy wasn't done yet. She sensed something in this case that transcended the ordinary legal proceedings. There was something here that wanted to be healed, and healing sometimes required taking risks that courtrooms weren't supposed to take. "I want to adjourn for 30 minutes, Judge Judy announced. "I want Mr. Henderson to sit alone in a room with a piece of paper, and I want him to write a letter, a real letter, not something for this court, a letter for Miguel. I want him to tell the truth in that letter. I want him to tell Miguel exactly why he broke his promise, what happened in his life, and what he actually feels about all of this." The bailiff looked confused. "Your Honor, is that appropriate for—" "I don't care if it's appropriate," Judge Judy said. "Do it." 30 minutes later, Robert Henderson returned to the courtroom with a handwritten letter. His hands were shaking as he held it. Judge Judy took the letter and read it silently, her expression revealing nothing. Then she did something that many courtroom observers would later say they had never seen her do before. She turned to Miguel and asked, "Would you like to hear what Mr. Henderson wrote to you?" Miguel nodded. Judge Judy began to read the letter aloud. In it, Robert Henderson had written about the day he had first met Miguel, about how the boy had reminded him of his own son, a child he had lost touch with years ago. He had written about how making that promise to Miguel had made him feel like he was doing something right in a life that had felt increasingly wrong. He had written about losing his job and feeling like a failure, and how that failure had been so overwhelming that he couldn't face Miguel anymore because he couldn't bear to see his own disappointment reflected in the boy's eyes. But then Robert had written something else. He had written that reading his own words, sitting alone in that room, had made him understand what he had done. He had understood that he had taken something precious from Miguel. He had taken a piece of a child's ability to trust, a piece of a child's hope for the future, and he had written that he didn't know if he could give that back, but he wanted to try. Robert had written that he was sorry, really, truly sorry. And he had written that even if he couldn't help Miguel get into a fancy private school, he could do something else. He could be honest, he could admit his mistakes, and he could ask Miguel if the boy might someday forgive him, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because forgiveness was something that was good for Miguel to give. When Judge Judy finished reading the letter, she looked up at Miguel. "Did you hear all of that?" she asked. Miguel nodded slowly. His eyes were wet with tears. "What do you want to say to Mr. Henderson?" Judge Judy asked. Miguel looked at Robert Henderson across the courtroom, and then, in a voice that was small but steady, he said, "I forgive you." The effect of those 3 words was immediate and profound. Robert Henderson put his face in his hands. His whole body shook. The courtroom erupted in emotional reaction. Some people were crying. Some were reaching for tissues. Maria Martinez, Miguel's mother, had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Judge Judy waited for the moment to settle before she spoke again, and when she did, her words would be quoted many times in the days and weeks that followed. "What happened in this courtroom today," Judge Judy said slowly, "is something I have learned very rarely happens in the legal system. A child forgave an adult, not because the adult deserved it, but because forgiveness is what children do when they are brave enough and good enough. Miguel, you have shown more wisdom and more strength than most adults I see in a lifetime of sitting on this bench." She turned to Robert Henderson. "And you, sir, have been given something more valuable than money. You have been given a second chance. That is a gift that many people never receive." Judge Judy paused, and then she made her ruling. "I'm not awarding monetary damages in this case. What would money accomplish? What would money do to heal what has been broken? Instead, I'm ordering something different. Mr. Henderson, you will work with Miguel on his education 3 times a week for the next 2 years. You will help him with his studies. You will be present for his school events. You will rebuild the trust that you damaged. And you will do this not because the law compels you, but because you have been given the grace of a child's forgiveness, and what you do with that grace will define the person you become." She looked at Maria Martinez, and Mrs. Martinez, "I encourage you to allow this relationship to continue, not for money, but because I believe that this man has genuinely been changed by what has happened here today. Sometimes people need to be broken before they can truly understand what matters." Judge Judy struck her gavel gently against the block. "This case is concluded, but everyone in the courtroom understood that in many ways, this case was just beginning." The video of Miguel's forgiveness was posted online by someone who had been in the courtroom that day. Within hours, it had been viewed thousands of times. By the next morning, it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times. The clip was simple. A child's voice saying, "I forgive you," and an adult breaking down in tears, but its power was undeniable. News outlets that had been covering Judge Judy for decades suddenly found themselves telling a different kind of story. The headlines didn't focus on the legal ruling or the monetary damages. Instead, they focused on the forgiveness. "Child's forgiveness moves nation." One headline read. Another said, "8-year-old's grace changes everything." A third simply stated, "What we can learn from a child's heart." The story reached beyond America. It spread to Europe, to Asia, to South America. People who had never heard of Judge Judy before found themselves watching this particular case over and over. They shared it with their families. They talked about it with their friends. They sat in quiet rooms after watching it and thought about their own relationships, their own mistakes, their own need for forgiveness. Psychologists and educators began to analyze what had happened in that courtroom. They wrote articles about childhood development and the remarkable capacity of children to forgive when adults rarely could. They discussed how forgiveness, true forgiveness, was one of the most powerful forces in human existence. One prominent psychologist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the University of California, wrote an essay that went viral on its own. In it, she talked about how society teaches children to hold grudges, to remember wrongs, to build walls of protection around their hearts. But Miguel had done the opposite. Miguel had listened to an adult's genuine remorse and had simply let go. He had chosen to forgive, and in doing so, he had revealed something essential about human nature. Children, Dr. Mitchell wrote, understand something that we adults often forget. They understand that forgiveness is not about erasing what happened. Forgiveness is about choosing to move forward anyway. It is about choosing hope over bitterness, connection over isolation, and growth over stagnation. The story also caught the attention of religious leaders and philosophers. Churches across the country used the story of Miguel's forgiveness as the basis for sermons about grace and redemption. One prominent pastor, Reverend James Williams, spoke about how he had been moved to tears by what a child had accomplished in a courtroom. He talked about how Miguel had demonstrated what Jesus had meant when he said, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them." He talked about how children possessed a spiritual wisdom that adults had spent lifetimes unlearning. But perhaps the most interesting responses came from people who wrote directly to Judge Judy, to Miguel, and to Robert Henderson. The producers of the television show received thousands of letters. One letter came from a woman named Patricia, who wrote that she had not spoken to her own father in 15 years. She had been holding on to anger and hurt, building walls that she thought would protect her. But watching Miguel forgive Robert Henderson had made her realize that the walls weren't protecting her. They were imprisoning her. She wrote that she had called her father the day after seeing the video. They had talked for 2 hours. They had both cried. They were not completely healed, but they were beginning again. Patricia's letter ended with a simple sentence: "A child I will never meet taught me something I needed to know." Another letter came from a man named Marcus, who had written about how he had broken promises to his own children. He had been working long hours, pursuing money and success, and he had missed important moments in his children's lives. He had made promises that he hadn't kept, caught up in the machinery of his own ambition. But seeing Miguel's forgiveness had made him stop. It had made him sit down and write letters to each of his children, apologizing, explaining, asking for a chance to do better. He had taken time off work. He had spent the last month with his family, being present in ways he had not been present in years. His letter to Judge Judy ended with gratitude. Gratitude that a child's forgiveness had saved his relationships with his own children before they were completely broken. Stories like these multiplied. The impact of what had happened in that one courtroom on that one Tuesday in October was spreading outward like ripples in water, touching lives that Miguel and Robert would never know about. It was changing how people thought about forgiveness, about promises, about the nature of right and wrong in human relationships. 3 months after the courtroom case, Judge Judy received an invitation to visit Miguel's school. The school wanted to honor what had happened, and they wanted to talk to the children about forgiveness and grace. Judge Judy, who was not sentimental by nature and who considered such appearances beneath her dignity most of the time, found herself saying yes. The gymnasium of Miguel's elementary school was packed with students, teachers, and parents on the day she visited. Miguel was there, sitting in the front row, his posture straight and his eyes bright. Robert Henderson was there too, standing in the back of the gymnasium. Over the 3 months since the courtroom decision, Robert had kept his promise. He had worked with Miguel 3 times a week. He had helped with homework. He had attended Miguel's school concert. He had been present. Judge Judy stood before all those children and talked about something she rarely discussed in public: the nature of human beings. She talked about how people made mistakes, how people broke promises, how people failed each other. But she also talked about something else. She talked about how children possessed a remarkable ability to give second chances, to forgive, to choose hope over bitterness. "I have spent my entire career in the legal system," Judge Judy told the children. "I have seen people sue each other over money, over property, over slights and insults. And I have learned that the law can sometimes solve problems, but it rarely heals anyone. Real healing comes from something else. Real healing comes from forgiveness. And I have learned from an 8-year-old boy named Miguel that children often understand this better than adults. She looked directly at Miguel. Miguel, what you did in that courtroom was extraordinary. You didn't have to forgive Robert Henderson. You had every right to stay angry. But you chose something better. You chose something harder. You chose to give him a chance to change. And because you did that, he is changing. That is power. Real power. The kind of power that law cannot grant, but that children possess naturally. She turned back to address all the students. I want each of you to remember this. When someone wrongs you, you have choices. You can hold on to anger. You can seek revenge. You can build walls. Those choices will keep you small, trapped inside your own hurt. Or you can forgive. You can give people chances to change. You can choose to believe in the goodness of human beings. That choice will make you larger, stronger and more alive than any other choice you could make. When Judge Judy finished speaking, the gymnasium erupted in applause. But it wasn't the polite applause that usually greets a visiting dignitary. It was genuine, heartfelt applause that came from children who had understood something important about the world and about themselves. After the assembly, Judge Judy spent time with Miguel privately. She gave him a leather-bound journal and suggested that he write in it every day, that he record his thoughts, his feelings, his dreams. You have shown wisdom beyond your years, she told him. You might as well use that wisdom to understand yourself. Miguel took the journal seriously. Over the following months, he filled it with thoughts about forgiveness, about what it meant to give people second chances, about his observations of the world around him. Some of his thoughts were remarkably mature. One entry read, Mr. Bobby says that forgiveness gave him permission to change. He says before I forgave him, he didn't believe he could change, but my forgiveness made him believe he could be better. That's interesting because it means that when you forgive someone, you're not just being nice, you're giving them something they need to grow. Robert Henderson also underwent a remarkable transformation. He had been working odd jobs, living in a small apartment, feeling like a failure. But the experience of being forgiven by a child, of being given a second chance, had awakened something in him. He had decided to go back to school to complete his high school diploma. He was working with an education program in the evenings while continuing to help Miguel with his studies during the day. 6 months after the courtroom case, Robert obtained his diploma. Miguel was at the ceremony. When Robert walked across the stage to receive his diploma, he looked into the audience and locked eyes with Miguel. Both of them were crying. Afterward, Miguel wrote in his journal, Today I learned that forgiveness doesn't just help the person who is forgiven, it also helps the person who does the forgiving. Because when I forgave Mr. Bobby, something changed in me too. I felt lighter. I felt like I could believe in people again. Judge Judy followed the progress of Miguel and Robert closely, more closely than she typically followed any case after a ruling was delivered. She received updates from Miguel Martinez. She heard that Robert was now studying to become a tutor, that he wanted to work with other struggling children. She heard that Miguel's grades had improved dramatically, that he had made new friends, that his confidence had grown. She heard that the relationship between Robert and Miguel had deepened into something that transcended the original promise. It had become a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and genuine care. 1 year after the courtroom case, Judge Judy received a package. It contained Miguel's journal, which Maria had asked Miguel to send to the judge. In a cover letter, Maria wrote that Miguel wanted Judge Judy to read his private thoughts, that he wanted her to know how the experience of forgiving Robert had changed him. Judge Judy sat in her office one afternoon and read through the entire journal. She read Miguel's thoughts on forgiveness, his observations about change, his understanding of human nature that seemed far too advanced for a 9-year-old boy. One entry particularly moved her. Miguel had written, Judge Judy said that forgiveness is a choice. I didn't know that before. I thought forgiveness was just something that happened to you, like rain or getting sick. But she was right. I chose to forgive Mr. Bobby. And that choice changed everything. It changed him. It changed me. It changed my mother, because she saw something in me that she hadn't seen before. It changed the other kids at school because some of them started being nicer to people they had been mad at. One choice can make so many things different. That's really important. Judge Judy wept as she read those words. She wept because she had been right all along, even though it had taken a child to teach her something she already knew. She wept because forgiveness was indeed the answer to so many human problems, not the legal system, not money, not punishment, but the simple choice to give another human being a chance to change. The impact of the case continued to spread. Educators incorporated the story into curricula. Therapists used the story in sessions with clients struggling with unforgiveness. Parents shared the story with their children when they needed to teach lessons about grace and second chances. Documentary filmmakers contacted Judge Judy about doing a full documentary on the case. Psychology textbooks cited the case as an example of childhood resilience and the power of forgiveness. But perhaps the most significant impact was the one that no one could measure. The one that existed in the private moments when people who had seen the video or read about the case made different choices in their own lives. The mother who called her estranged son, the father who apologized to his daughter, the friend who forgave a betrayal, the colleague who let go of resentment, the family member who chose to begin again. These were the real impacts of Miguel's forgiveness, the invisible ripples spreading outward, touching lives in ways that statistics could never capture. 2 years after the courtroom case, on a warm afternoon in June, Judge Judy received another visit. Robert Henderson came to her office with Miguel and Maria. Robert was working as a tutor at a youth center, helping children with learning difficulties. Miguel was a fifth grader, thriving in school, on the honor roll, his confidence restored and expanded. Maria was working steadily, her worry lines softened by the knowledge that her son had found healing and hope. When Judge Judy saw them, she stood from her desk and came around to greet them properly. She hugged Miguel, which was something she rarely did with people who came to her office. "You changed your own life," she told him. "And you changed his life," she said, indicating Robert. "And in ways you will never fully understand, you changed many other lives too. That is the power of forgiveness." Miguel, now almost 11 years old, looked at Judge Judy with the same calm wisdom that had characterized him even as an 8-year-old. "You taught me that," he said. "You didn't just judge the case. You showed me that there was another way." Judge Judy smiled. "No," she said. "I didn't teach you anything. You already knew it. I just gave you permission to express it. Forgiveness is not something that needs to be taught. It is something that needs to be allowed, freed, released from the prisons we build around our hearts." As they left her office, Judge Judy watched them go. She watched Miguel walk down the hallway with his mother's hand on his shoulder, and Robert walking beside them like a part of the family. And she thought about all the courtroom cases she had presided over, all the rulings she had made, all the damages she had awarded, and she realized that this one case, this one moment of a child's forgiveness, would stay with her for the rest of her life in a way that no other case would. Because in the end, justice was not just about the law. Justice was about seeing human beings as they really were, broken and flawed and struggling, but also capable of extraordinary grace. And justice was about creating space for that grace to emerge, to flourish, to change people and worlds. Miguel's forgiveness had done that. It had revealed the possibility of something better than punishment, something more powerful than the law. It had revealed the simple truth that a child already knew, that forgiveness was not weakness, forgiveness was strength, and in a world that desperately needed healing, forgiveness was the only path forward.